I think it's only fitting at the start of this series that we pay homage to the first and preeminent of all the superstar teachers. The person with whom I'll be beginning this course, Socrates, of course, who taught in Athens in the 5th century BC. He was a teacher who never wore a jacket, and I think it's probably appropriate for me to take mine off now, never wore a tie, and even more remarkably, never published a single thing. But he had an extraordinary strength, and that was the capacity to inspire. He was so inspirational that we know him not only for his teachings, but perhaps more remarkably for his students. Socrates, as you know, is the teacher of Plato, who wrote the first key text that we'll be analyzing in a few moments, the Republic. And then Plato, as you know, was so inspirational that he himself was the teacher of the second best student ever to be taught, I think, Aristotle. And we'll be examining Aristotle's politics after we finish with Plato's Republic. Socrates inspired. He inspired us to do what? Well, as he says in Plato's work, The Apology, he inspired us to undertake the most difficult of all tasks, and that is to examine oneself, because the unexamined life is not worth living. As he said that, Socrates marked the moment when political theory was born. It was born, we might say, in Athens, in the marketplace of that town in ancient Greece, about 410 BC. We know this because Plato, in his dialogue, the Gorgias, tells us this beautiful story about that magical moment in Greek history. He says that Socrates was teaching in the Agra, the marketplace, and he had with him a few of his friends, Plato among them. Remember, Socrates was ultimately to be convicted of corrupting the youth, of charges of impiety, and in 399 BC was forced to take the hemlock, an example that I hope not many superstar teachers would have to follow. Socrates, then teaching in 410 BC, had around him this group of friends, young people, students, teaching them the eternal verities, the questions that mean most in life. What is justice? What is goodness? What is beauty? What is truth? What is wisdom? And how can we know what we do not know? He became a pest to some people teaching these questions, a real nuisance, because he was constantly buttonholing people and asking them these questions as they would rush off to make a deal or whatever. And as he was teaching among his students in this special place at this particular moment of time, off in the distance, Plato tells us we see Callicles coming. Now, Callicles was an extremely successful businessman, a wheeler-dealer who was concerned about one thing, we're told, and that was how to make the next drachma. He was concerned above all, though, with preaching the ideology of sophism, that is, that all truth is relative. And in that respect, he denied that Socrates could get anywhere in asking ultimate questions like, what is truth? Because truth one day will be this, and truth the next day will be that. And so let's not press these eternal questions. Socrates, then, as he sees Callicles coming in the distance, says to Plato, here comes Callicles. Maybe we can involve him in our discussion. And Plato says, no way, Socrates, you know, Callicles isn't interested in such things, but as Callicles comes closer, Socrates signals him and says, join us, please. And Callicles says, Socrates, I won't have any of your nonsense. I'm fed up with this eternal questioning. We want you to shut up. And as I said, a few years later, they did shut him up permanently. So Socrates said, wait, Callicles, please. Reaches out and puts his hand on Callicles' shoulder, and as Plato tells it, says, Callicles, we're engaged here in a discussion of some importance, and that is we're trying to determine what course of life is best. At that moment, political theory is born with that question. It is the question of questions that political theory tries to ask. And when I teach, as I do political theory, I ask students in my class to begin during their undergraduate period, above all, with this question: what course of life is best? If one doesn't answer it, or ask it at least, at age 18, 19, 20, then perhaps you know it may become too late to ask it at all. Socrates was insisting that those around him ask that question. And they did. Plato, when he takes up this question at the beginning of his Republic, the magnum opus of Plato's works, the outstanding work of political theory. Alfred North Whitehead, the Harvard philosopher, once said, I think in an exaggeration, but nevertheless some truth to it, that all of European philosophy consists of a series of footnotes to Plato's Republic. If we can go that far, and I think that is a bit hyperbolic, nevertheless, if we can say that, some truth to it, the point that Plato makes in the Republic, to begin with, is that this question, what course of life is best, should not be considered in an individual sense. It must be considered in a political sense, that there's a natural, a necessary, an essential relationship between the political and the personal. That is, it's unfair to ask any individual to discover what course of life is best if his or her state is not supportive. And so in the Republic, what Plato tries to do, and this is the essence of his quest, is to show how the state must support one in one's Socratic quest, in one's struggle. And so the Republic, of course, as you perhaps know, is not a work about an individual Socratic quest as much as it is about establishing an ideal state, setting the context within which one can find one's special excellence or one's right way of thinking, the course of life that one should pursue. The Republic. It's a work that constitutes a dialogue between Socrates and a series of figures. And remember the first question, what course of life is best, but we're quickly taken to a question within that question, and that is, what is right conduct? What is fair conduct? What is just conduct? How should one behave? Socrates first takes on a traditionalist in Athens, a figure by the name of Polemarchus, a young man who is concerned with arguing the traditional wisdom of Athens at this time. And Polemarchus, when he's asked the question by Socrates, what is justice, what is fairness, what is a right way to behave, he says, I've got the answer. Our Greek sage Simonides, our poet, has told us, justice is no more than rendering to each man his due. And Polemarchus says, it's simple. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's justice. And Socrates says, well, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting way of addressing the question. That justice should constitute no more than this. And Socrates says, sure, certainly it's clear that justice must concern harming one's enemies, helping one's friends, but is that right, Polemarchus? And he begins to probe. And he takes about 13 or 14 pages at the beginning of the Republic probing this question. And he's, of course, trying to make 2 points as he probes. One is that we must not accept our father's sayings, even if they're from on high, the wisdom of Simonides. We must go beyond the traditional gods. He's eventually, as we said, Socrates, convicted of impiety, of defying the wisdom of Athens. And now at the opening of the Republic, he does defy it, and he asks, is it true, is it right that justice constitutes this, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? For the first time in classical Greek literature, we have an individual asserting now at the beginning of the Republic that justice should not involve harming another person, even harming one's enemies. And Socrates, in refuting Polemarchus, says that it's never right to harm another person. And why should that be? Plato uses this opportunity to expound his central doctrine that each one of us has within us not just an essence, not just a humanity, not just a quality of being and of bearing that is inviolable, but rather a special excellence, which the Greeks called arete, that is, a quality of character that constitutes a gift. And then Socrates, in this perfect way as a teacher, responds to Polemarchus and says, if one is to be an ideal teacher, a true model of education, one never interacts with another in a harmful way. One always tries to fulfill the role of the teacher in trying to elicit the best from that individual. And one can never do that if one harms another. And so Socrates manages, in these opening shot at Polemarchus, to question traditional Greek wisdom, to question the whole ancient concept of justice, but more than that, to assert the idea that there is a dignity of humanity that must not be violated. And what more than that is he doing? He's saying, of course, that justice may not require harming another individual. Behavior, in order for it to be right, may require, certainly, may demand inflicting injury on another. But that's not justice. We can never justify a harmful action, doing violence to another person, by calling it in principle right. It can never be fair and good and true to harm another individual. It may be pragmatically necessary. It may be justified as an act of war, but let's not justify it in terms of morality. That response to Polemarchus, it seems to me, has lived on throughout today to ask whether there can be a just war, whether it's possible to use justice or fairness or goodness in that sense. This is the first response of Socrates: no. And Plato, in trying to define then fairness or justice, makes this point: there is something wrong about Greek traditional wisdom. Now, the next figure that comes into the story, Thrasymachus, is a sophist like Callicles. And I can borrow my glasses now because we'll be referring to the Republic. Thrasymachus is a figure who has gone down in history for one doctrine, and that is the doctrine of might is right. I think that Plato is being unfair to Thrasymachus, probably in many respects, here when he talks about might is right, identified necessarily with the sophists. It seems to me that the sophists have more to say as a school of thought in Athens at this time or at any time than just might is right. But Thrasymachus comes on powerfully in the beginning of the Republic with this argument. And notice the essence of the argument. The argument is that Socrates, in trying to assert absolute truths that Polemarchus, after all, hadn't questioned because Greek traditional wisdom had accepted the necessity of absolute truths. But Socrates, in arguing for absolute truths, that truth did have a meaning above and beyond a particular context, is fundamentally wrong. But Socrates is wrong because he's not a relativist. Socrates is wrong because he, in an absolutist way, implies that there are eternal answers for these eternal questions. What is justice? What is justice, then? Well, within this might is right framework, Thrasymachus argues that justice is no more than what happens to be in the interest of the stronger party at any one particular time. That's justice. It will change from time to time because obviously a person will be, as a ruler, for example, powerful at one time, not powerful at another. What happens to be justice at one time will not be at another time. And Thrasymachus says this is as it should be. There is, from Thrasymachus' point of view, then no continuing, no ongoing definition for justice. There is only one truth, and that is might is right. What is right is what happens to be said by the stronger party, and we cannot go beyond that. Thrasymachus' argument at this point is so powerful that Socrates claims it leaves him stunned, unaware of what to say, because it's an entirely different ballgame than what Polemarchus was arguing. Polemarchus he was able to dispatch quite easily, after all, by saying to Polemarchus, well, Simonides is just wrong, you haven't got the tradition right, or if the tradition needs to be interpreted or whatever. Whereas with Thrasymachus, there is a fundamental challenge here about the very essence of what Socrates is trying to do, and that is to assert the eternal nature of certain truths, that there is such a thing as justice. Thrasymachus goes on to say that a ruler at any particular time is concerned only with enforcing his particular will, and we must look only to that state that has power, that has ultimate strength. And Socrates says at this point, wait a minute, Thrasymachus, haven't you gone too far here in terms of your might is right doctrine? Is politics for you, is ruling for you, only an assertion of might? And Thrasymachus says, yes, of course it is that. And Socrates says, but shouldn't it be something more than that? Shouldn't it require knowledge? Isn't there something like an art or even a science to politics that demands certain standards? Thrasymachus at first shrinks from this argument. Then he meets it head on and says, no, cannot. Socrates comes to it, and I think at this point, the whole concept is born of the department that I teach in, political science. That is, that there is a science to politics. That is, there is, in essence, a knowledge to be achieved about politics, a standard to be met. That is, the ruler can't act wholly in accord with whim. Socrates tries for the rest of the dialogue in the Republic to make this argument, that there is a wisdom needed in order to rule, that might is not sufficient, that standards are important. And it's significant that he goes to two analogies. The first analogy is the analogy to the physician, and the second analogy is the analogy to the musician. In both analogies, the ruler to the musician and the ruler to the physician, he's arguing that in order to achieve an art, a professional wisdom, in politics, we must follow the example of the physician or the musician. And in a nice point that he makes in terms of his analogy to the physician in the Republic, he says this: the physician as such, we know, studies only the patient's interest and not his own. For as we agreed, the business of the physician in the strict sense is not to make money for himself, but to exercise his power over the patient's body. So it should be with government of any kind. No ruler, insofar as he is acting as ruler, will study or enjoin only what is to his own interest. All that he says and does will be said and done with a view to what is good and proper for the subject for whom he practices his art. For the subject for whom he practices his art. Note the argument. It's, in essence, why can't politics be more like medicine? Later on, it's why can't politics be more like music? That is, why in politics can't we use our power wisely? And this is, in essence, what Socrates is doing right at the beginning of the Republic and all throughout. And that is to argue ultimately that there are two forms of power. A form of power that Thrasymachus is setting forth, the power of might, the power of coercion, the power of force. And another kind of power, the power that a physician has, the power of knowledge. The question is whether or not a polity can be established that will be based upon knowledge and not whim or coercion or might or force. Plato's argument in the Republic is that this is possible, but the two phases of power are there throughout. And as we'll see, Plato concludes with them, in fact. The two phases of power being the power of belief, or the power of whim, or the power of might, or the power of coercion on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the power of knowledge. The physician argument, the physician analogy, is carried through the Republic, and we find even at the end of the book, Plato asserting that there is such a thing as a diseased polity and a healthy polity. What is a healthy polity? A polity that's ruled by an individual who has knowledge, who has wisdom. What is a diseased polity? A polity that's continually subject to war, to commerce to the point where everything becomes a question of money. A diseased polity is marked then by, as Plato says, inflammation, the fever of trying to make money or trying to go to war. Whereas a wise polity, ruled by people with knowledge, is marked by the opposite. And that is a healthy rule of what? Rule of reason. Thrasymachus sits down. He's had his say. But the argument of the sophists is revived by the next figure, Glaucon. Glaucon is one of Plato's brothers, actually. He's more sympathetic towards Socrates than Thrasymachus. But he feels that Thrasymachus' argument hasn't been stated fully or well. And so he revives it and says, let's restate the argument, Socrates, and look at it again. Thrasymachus, Glaucon says, was essentially looking at rule, but we can take this argument further, Glaucon says, in terms of what is justice, what is fairness, what is goodness, what is right conduct. Let's take it further and question, Socrates, the very assumption that you're making that we have it within us as individuals, as people, to achieve something like fairness or right conduct. And Glaucon says, let's look at the core of the issue. What is the nature of human nature? And he says that we can understand this by telling a little story, a myth, kind of parable. And it's known as the myth of Gyges in the Republic. And the story, as it's told by Glaucon at this point, is of a shepherd who, as he's roaming the fields, suddenly a hurricane comes along, earthquake. And the earthquake strikes a giant chasm in the earth. The shepherd Gyges descends into the chasm, and he sees a giant corpse with a ring on his finger. Gyges, the shepherd, goes and takes the ring off the finger. Doesn't know what power he has. At the next shepherd's meeting, we're told, Gyges just happens, as he's sitting there at the edge of the circle, to turn the ring. And he finds, by virtue of listening to comments about him, that when he turns the ring a certain way, he becomes invisible. When he turns it back again, he becomes visible. He has the power of a god. What does he do with his power? Does he found a philanthropic organization and take us to sweetness and light? Far from it. He contrives to become a messenger to the king. He murders the king. He seduces the queen, seizes the throne. Glaucon says this: if a just man and an unjust man, so-called, were both to have rings of this kind, both to have the power to become invisible, do you imagine, Glaucon says, that the so-called just man is going to continue to be a just and fair person? Far from it. He'll turn his own Gyges gene loose on society, and he'll become as wicked as the unjust man. Human nature, Glaucon says, is precisely this. It's a nature that demands, that determines an aggressive behavior. Human nature is no more than dog eat dog, than the big fish eating the little fish. And this is the sophist's wisdom. The sophists, who claim that truth is only relative, nevertheless also claim this, that there are ongoing truths, and one of the big ongoing truths is that human nature is evil and rotten. When we meet Machiavelli time after next this afternoon, we'll see that Machiavelli wholeheartedly agrees with this view. Plato highlighting this particular point, this truth then, and that is, what is human nature? This question. Socrates comes back at Glaucon and says, do you really believe this? Do you really believe all this, that there's a Gyges gene in all of us, that we're aggressive, that if we have the power, we'll eat each other up, that justice is no more than compulsion? Do you really believe that we behave as we do only because we fear punishment? Is that the only reason justice exists, because people fear punishment? And Glaucon says, yes, it's exactly what I believe, and if you don't believe it, prove to me that it's not true. And then we get a long, key section of the Republic setting forth Plato's view of human nature in this brilliant way that Plato has, setting forth in a couple of pages Glaucon's view of human nature, which is the sophist's view of human nature for all intents and purposes, and then Plato following with a long statement of his view of human nature. It's brilliant because for the first time in political theory we have set forth a concept about human nature that's going to be repeated, as we'll see, by subsequent political theorists, what we call the tripartite theory of the personality. That is, that every personality, your personality, my personality, has three components: reason, spirit, or honor, or courage, as Plato calls it, and desire, or appetite. Socrates sets forth this concept of human nature, that all of us have the capacity to reason. Certain individuals, Socrates says, have the capacity to reason better than others. And these individuals should rule. These individuals become philosophers. These individuals emerge as the gifted few who can lead our polity with the power of wisdom, the power of knowledge, to a state of justice. That's the argument. And it's the statement early on in political theory of the most optimistic, wildly utopian view or vision of human nature that we have. Nowhere do we find in political theory a more optimistic point of view than in Plato's Republic. That is, that we can achieve a state ruled by people who have a certain kind of insight as a result of their achieving rule within themselves of reason, and so rule within the polis. Plato talks about this rule of reason in a number of places in the Republic, but one of my favorites is when he says, "It will be the business of reason to rule, to exercise power with wisdom and forethought on behalf of the entire soul. Justice is not, Glaucon, a matter of external behavior. Justice must come from the inward self. And it must attend to all that is, in the fullest sense, a man's proper concern. The just man does not allow the several elements in his soul to usurp one another's functions. He is indeed one who sets his house in order by self-mastery and discipline, coming to be at peace with himself and bringing into tune those three parts like the terms in the proportion of a musical scale. Only when he has linked these three parts together in well-tempered harmony and has made himself one man instead of many, will he be ready to go about whatever he may have to do, whether it be making money and satisfying bodily wants or business transactions and honorable conduct. He will mean the behavior that helps to produce and preserve this habit of mind. And by wisdom he will mean the knowledge which presides over such conduct. Any action which tends to break down this habit will be for him unjust, and the notions governing it he will call ignorance and folly." And the question is, how is this all to be attained? Jean-Jacques Rousseau calls this the finest treatise on education ever written. It's certainly one of the most important works on education that any Western political theorist has written, because the book is all about a system of education. When we meet again Machiavelli, time after next this afternoon, we'll see that Machiavelli has no belief in education, because people, they can't be changed. Plato has the belief not only in education, but education is the method to shape the polity that he wants. It will be all easy enough, Socrates says, if only they will see to that one great thing. I would rather call it the one thing that's sufficient: education. If a sound education can only make them reasonable men, they will easily see their way through any difficult matter that we face. Because when a community has once made a good start, its growth proceeds in a sort of cycle. If a sound system of nurture and education is maintained, it produces men of good disposition, and above all, of ability to rule. The tripartite personality, then. And the method that is to achieve this, eliciting from each of us our best, and those who have the rational quality in abundance, the best means philosophical understanding and insight. Plato sets forth then in this book a hope that this polity may be achieved. He says in order for it to be achieved, three basic changes. He calls them tidal waves of revolutionary change and transformation must occur. We need the educational system in place, but in addition to that, what else do we need? He sets forth in the middle of the Republic now his doctrine of the three waves, that is, these tidal waves of change. Number one, he says, with the tripartite personality in place and this whole structure of the polis in mind, with a method of education established, number one, we must, when we're educating people, ferret out the intelligence of each person and educate that person regardless of sex. That is, men and women must be equal in our educational system. Men and women must share alike in the practice, in the art, in the science of rule. For the first time in classical Greek thought, indeed for the first time in any system of ancient thought, Chinese, Indian, or Greek, European, we have this assertion that women may rule. Previously, of course, people in Athens, especially as we'll see next lecture, Aristotle, assert that women are genetically incapable of ruling. Plato argues that no one is genetically incapable of ruling by virtue of sex. Intelligence is not sex-linked. Individuals must be educated and judged. We elicit from them their best regardless of gender. That's the first big revolutionary wave of change. And if Plato is anything, he is a revolutionary, if only on this particular point, and that is his view of women. The next revolutionary change that's to occur is among the ruling class, once the educational system, remember, is in place, there is to be no institution of the nuclear family or of private property. Now, this is argued through as the second wave, the second tidal wave of revolutionary change, very systematically throughout the Republic. As we'll see, Aristotle is most upset as Plato's student about this particular wave of revolutionary change. That is, that family and property should be abolished. Or, as Plato would prefer to say it, that private property is abolished, but rather the guardian class, that is, the ruling group, become one common family. Plato argues it on this basis. Does not the worst evil for a state, he says, arise from anything that tends to render it asunder and destroy its unity, while nothing does it more good than whatever tends to bind it together? And are not citizens bound together by sharing in the same pleasures and pains, all feeling glad or grieved on the same occasion of gain or loss, whereas the bond is broken when such feelings are no longer universal? And then he comes up, which I think is with an elegant metaphor, and that is, he says, when one of us hurts his finger, the whole extent of those bodily connections which are gathered up in the soul and unified by its ruling element is made aware, and it all shares as a whole in the pain of the suffering part. Hence we say that the man has a pain in his finger. The same thing is true of the pain or pleasure felt when any other part of the person suffers or is relieved. So, Glaucon, the best organized community comes nearest to that condition. It will recognize as a part of itself the individual citizen to whom good or evil happens and will share as a whole in his joy or sorrow. Now, that we call, in political science, the organic theory of the polis, or of the state. For the first time, we have set forth the idea that just as the body is an organism, so the state may be an organism. But how nicely it's set forth here. The main argument being that just as he said, a person always, the brain feels the pain and sends messages throughout the body when a finger is lost. In this way, we must construct a state that is so together, so cohesive, that individuals will feel pain when one member is lost, that the whole body politic will experience joy when one person experiences joy. Plato's argument then is this, that there is such a thing as a state, as an organic unit, that individuals can, he says, feel interests in common, that we're not doomed to continuing struggles and factions over private interests. Quite the contrary. From Plato's point of view, we enjoy instead, by virtue of our reason, this capacity to come together and to realize that we have some common interests and to struggle together for them. And we want to underline this second wave, as it's called, in the Republic, because Aristotle, as I said, is to object to it so strongly, but then Rousseau, later on, remember we'll meet Rousseau the last lecture today, goes back to precisely this image, precisely this point about the organic theory of the polity, and builds most of his idea of the civil state on exactly this argument, that there can be a unit called the state in which all of us will experience a general will. The third of the three waves has been anticipated before, and it's simply, Plato says, that philosophers should rule, or that rulers be philosophers. In that case, power will be used wisely. To use power wisely, that is the object. The climax of the Republic comes with the allegory of the cave. I suppose if you've heard about any part of the Republic, it's the allegory of the cave. One student who took my course came back 10 years later and said, I've forgotten everything about your political theory course except one thing, and that is Plato's cave. How could anybody forget that? It's become so unforgettable that people like E.M. Forster in Passage to India and other writers take the cave as a symbol. A symbol of what? Well, as you know from Passage to India, it's a symbol of illusion, isn't it? And so it is with Plato's Republic. He says in the allegory of the cave chapter that imagine us, imagine any group of people chained together, able to look only in one direction, that direction being the wall of the cave. We cannot turn our heads. We cannot even know that we're in a cave. Imagine, he says, if one individual managed somehow to get free from these chains, to break through, to ascend to the light of the day outside. Imagine if that were to occur, just imagine. And then he came back into the cave. What would the people do to him when he began to tell them that they were in a cave? And he says, they'd kill him, just as they did Socrates. That whole anticipation of a Christ-like kind of situation. Coming back, telling the truth, and what happens? We must, Plato says, and we can do this, not only get people out of the cave and out into the light, but bring them back in and make them the rulers of our polis. Have them take authority in the state. And Glaucon says, and what will happen then, Socrates? And Socrates says, well, unlike any ruler of the present day, they will think of holding power maybe at first as an unavoidable necessity. But the truth, Glaucon, is that you can have a well-governed society only if you can discover for your future rulers a better way of life than being in office. Then only will power be in the hands of men who are rich not in gold, but in the wealth that brings happiness, a good and wise life. All goes wrong when, starved for lack of anything good in their own lives, men turn to public affairs hoping to snatch from thence the happiness they hunger for. Then they set about fighting for power. So whom can you compel to undertake the guardianship of the Commonwealth, if not those who, besides understanding best the principles of government, enjoy a nobler life than the politicians and look for rewards of a different kind? This is the vision. And Plato, more than any other political theorist that we can study, understands this truth, that where there is no vision, the people perish. He set up an ideal, an archetypal model of a kind of state that can be ruled wisely. he said something about the political situation which we in the United States and in other countries have to stretch our minds in order to understand, in order to imagine, and that is that there can be intelligence in politics. That is, that there is a way of thinking and of being in politics that is analogous perhaps to medicine. That is, that when we look at our rulers today and ask whether or not we can sue for malpractice, and cannot, precisely because this book, written 2,300 years ago, was not taken seriously, not at all. But now it should be taken increasingly seriously because it sets forth this kind of vision. It's a vision that urges us to marshal all our forces and to ask ourselves whether or not we can achieve a just polity. The search is for a course of life that is indeed best. If we can achieve that, and this is Plato's point, we can achieve it only when we link the personal with the political. Only if we manage to give our young people, especially in this society, all the support through an excellent educational system that we can to allow them to understand this, that power need not corrupt, that power can be used wisely, that power can be linked to an ideal political order. It's a vision that Aristotle will challenge in a few moments when we turn to the politics. Thank you.